There are moments in every person's life when they face intense adversity. They're crucibles that forge who they become as individuals and as leaders. Now more than ever, we need leaders who are called to a higher standard, focused on leaving it better than they found it, and paying it forward to the next generations. Now, let's join Fire Chief Randy Brugman as he speaks with leaders from all walks of life, as he explores and learns from their personal journeys and the crucibles that have forged them into better leaders and better people.
Welcome to the Leadership Crucible podcast. Thanks for joining me today. The importance of education in developing critical thinking, knowledge, and the skill sets needed for our future generations cannot be overstated. Today it's my pleasure to have Nathan Sheldon, head of school at Casady School in Oklahoma City, with me today. Nathan was born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. His parents, linguistic missionaries, moved Nathan to the heart of the Amazon jungle to live with an indigenous group called Amura Prahar. At about 11, the family moved out of the jungle to Brasilia. Nathan would live in Brasilia until his senior year in high school when the family moved to the U.S., where Nathan graduated high school. He attended John Brown University and graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a master's in accounting with a tax emphasis. He married his college sweetheart Staci in the fall of 1990. They have two grown children, Sarah and Stephen. Nathan started his career in accounting working with Deloitte Touche in the tax department. He transitioned to the finance side of accounting, serving as controller for Candid Color and then as the wholesale controller for the largest food distributor in the country, Fleming Foods. He is finishing his 19th year at Casady School, a premier independent school in Oklahoma City, first as a director of operations and for the last 8 years as head of the school. Casady School is an independent day school with approximately 990 boys and girls in grades pre-K through 12. Nathan, thanks for joining me on the Leadership Crucible podcast today. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks. I know you've faced many situations in your life that have probably tested you and helped shape who you've become as a leader and as a person. And would you mind sharing a couple of those with our audience today?
Sure. So, Randy, why don't I just share a couple that are more recent and that I think might be relevant. I think one of the things that, as an older guy, I've learned is that life lessons teach you a lot, right? And so I remember I've been at this job now I'm entering into my 20th year, my 9th as head of school. Before that, I was the CFO. And I can remember a time when we were searching for the next head of school. We had an abrupt change in our school, and we were searching for the next head of school. And I had made the decision that I actually thought as an interim that I was making some positive changes with our people, our faculty, and I wanted to continue that role if I could. And so I let a fellow by the name of Jim Wickenden of Wickenden & Associates know that I was going to be putting my name in the hat. And I'll never forget, because he said, Nathan, I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate that you're the interim. I know that the board appreciates your role that you're playing now. However, I also don't think there's any chance that you're going to be selected as head of school. You've not come up the teaching ranks. You don't have the pedagogy. You don't have all of the things that we're looking for in a top flight head of school educator. And I remember distinctly that night going home and saying to my wife, okay, he has no idea what he just lit under me. And one of the things that I've learned about myself is that it's really important and it's okay to be competitive and to be confident. It's really not good to be cocky. And so I entered that process with the confidence that I was going to learn everything I could about what it meant to lead a school in order to show the board and the selection committee that I did have the skill sets, not just to be the CFO of an organization, but rather to lead an organization. And so I learned early on that you have to sometimes have the confidence, even if you don't necessarily have the skills to do what you're wanting to do. And that was something that was really helpful for me. It was born out of the wrong idea, right? It was born out of the, oh, really? I'll show you. But the truth of the matter is, I think leadership, in leadership, you have to have the confidence sometimes to go places where you've never been before, but not show that kind of the fact that you don't know what's going on. And then the other thing that the school setting has taught me is that there are so many voices in a room that have so much wisdom. And I remember I taught Algebra 1 when I first started for about 3 years, because we didn't have the money to afford a part-time math teacher. And I remember one time I was teaching a section of Algebra 1, and I was solving quadratic equations. And I was going over these quadratic equations. I was going over them, and the kids were just constantly, Mr. Sheldon, I don't have a clue what you're saying. You're making no sense at all. And I'm beginning to wonder whether they're just playing me, right? So I'm beginning to get a little upset with them. They're probably a little frustrated with me. And I remember one of the girls in the class, her name was Megan Swisher, and she said, Mr. Sheldon, would you mind if I show them how to do this? And she got up on the board, and I'm not kidding you, Randy, I think she used 95% of the words I used and the way I did it. But when she was done, the class resoundingly said, Mr. Sheldon, if you would have just said it that way, we would have gotten it. And it made me realize and recognize that there are so many different ways to communicate. And the real value of a leader is to understand when you're not being an effective communicator and letting someone else take that center stage and take that role. And what Megan did, if I would have listened to her earlier, would have saved us probably 20 minutes in a class time. So I think that those are two just kind of small examples of things that, for me, have helped shape kind of who I am and the way I approach leadership in the position that I have today.
Well, the wisdom of crowds is often much more important than our own ego, right?
For sure.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I've often found that, being a fire chief, if you want to build a fire truck, you don't let fire chiefs build fire trucks. You let the people that actually are operating them every day build the fire truck.
Well said.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So you didn't start in education. You moved from a fairly lucrative tax professional position, ultimately coming to this school, and then ultimately being the headmaster. So how did that all happen?
Right. So, Randy, life throws you kind of a twist and a turn, I think, and it's how you handle them and what you make of them. When I was at the Fleming companies, I was the controller of the largest wholesale food distributor in the country, and really finance was my passion, right? So I enjoyed finance. I had a group of about 200 accountants that worked in my area, and my goal in life was to become the CFO of a Fortune 500 company. When my son was 2, he began to regress in terms of the progress that he was making, not so much in his motor skills. He was walking and he was doing the things that you would expect of a 2-year-old, but his ability to articulate and to enunciate things went from being able to say kind of mama, dada, to absolutely nothing, just grunting. And we knew something was wrong. So we took him, and ultimately a pediatric neurologist diagnosed him as moderately autistic. Well, that event was probably the event that changed my trajectory in my life the most, because it forced us to look at what we were doing as a family and how it was impacting Stephen. And so I traveled about anywhere from 5 to 6 days a week, going out to the divisions and to different parts of our business. And I was not home often. And every time I would come home, it was a whole new learning experience for my son to figure out who the heck is this guy that's now in my life again, in my space, with this lady that I have a lot of confidence in, but I don't really know what his role is in our family. And so we made the decision as a family for me to stop doing what I was doing, and to just trust that something would materialize. And so I expected to go into another company, and at the time, while I was unemployed, a friend of mine said, Nathan, I know of a school, a small independent school in Oklahoma City, that is struggling financially. And my background was that I was part of a team that oftentimes would go into our company and help kind of revitalize business units that maybe were struggling. And so I thought, this can't be that hard. It's a small organization, maybe $20 million a year, really small. I was coming from a $19 billion a year sales organization to, something that's in the millions. It can't be that difficult. And so I interviewed for the position. I didn't have the position outright, but I interviewed for it, and ultimately accepted and took the position. And And that first year, when we didn't have enough money for us to hire a teacher, because math was a thing for me, I thought, how hard can teaching be? Uh, those who can do and those who can't teach, which was absolutely the worst thing in my head to think. I offered to teach this class, and what happened was I began to recognize how incredibly powerful the teaching world is in affecting the lives of the youth, and I loved it. I played soccer and I played tennis in college at a small NAIA college, and so I coached, and I fell in love with just interacting with kids. So I remember saying to my wife, it's probably the second year of working to kind of build this organization back up. I remember saying to her, honey, what if we didn't go back to the lifestyle we had? And it took Staci no time at all to say, you know what? Absolutely. Our kids have their father back. I have a husband back, and you seem a lot more content. And I realized that maybe what I didn't know about myself was that I really belonged working with kids. Maybe it's my mental acuity is not, it's that of a child. But I fell in love with the atmosphere of teaching. I fell in love with the rhythm of that. I am by no means an expert teacher. I don't even pretend to be one. But I do enjoy being around kids, and I do enjoy the fact that we have an opportunity to impact the lives of kids who will later impact the country as we know it today.
Yeah, isn't it interesting sometimes how our own journeys we kind of back into where we end up where we're supposed to be.
Right. Yeah. There's a karma to life, and it just finds you, and you don't find it.
Yeah. But you do know when you find your passion.
For sure.
Yeah. Right. So,
Absolutely.
when we talked before, Stephen's had quite the. He just graduated from college.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Yep. Yeah. Honestly, and so Randy, if I could just share with you, because I think this is really a cool story. But Staci, my wife, worked one-on-one. We hired some therapists to come in because Oklahoma at the time had nothing for autistic children. And Stephen, this year in May, graduated with a structural engineering degree. He's working for an engineering firm, a large engineering firm, and we couldn't be more proud of the progress he's made. He's a bit goofy, but so am I. And so that's just chip off the old block. So I don't think that's anything that has anything to do with his learning differences. It has everything to do with his genetics.
Well, and I think it also points out that, oftentimes these kids are lost in the system.
Mm-hmm.
And,
for sure.
So I think it just, number one, it bodes to you and your wife about, your commitment to the child, but also about going and finding the right help, because oftentimes that's the connection that they need to have to be successful in life.
Without a doubt, Randy, and we're blessed. We had the financial means to go ahead and use the resources that we could use. I do think there's an opportunity out there that we could do more to help families that don't have the same opportunities that maybe our family was afforded, because you're right, early intervention makes such a big difference in the lives of these kids.
Yeah. So I know that there are many in your school that describe you as a servant leader, which is a true testament to, how you lead every day. But what does servant leadership mean to you, and how do you really engage that philosophy on a day-to-day basis?
I'm not sure that there's any right answer to what is servant leadership. I think we've all read books, and they all define servant leadership in various ways. For me, and I can only speak to what servant leadership looks like in my life, it's being willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with your team. I think you have to be willing to get in the trenches when you need to get in the trenches, but also be willing to pull out and sometimes make those decisions that are good for the institution, but maybe not readily apparent to everyone in the institution. And so then your role as a servant leader is to help convince them that the direction that you're pointing us is the direction that we want to go. And I think about the fact that at the end of the day, I think a servant leader, I think that their team accomplishes a lot of good and never once thinks of it as the leadership or the leader that's doing it. You almost take a back seat to the process by empowering your team to take the lead. And it stems from that idea that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that comes from that standing shoulder to shoulder with your team. So if we're going somewhere, I will get in the trenches with them, and we will go together. I think it's different depending on what type of organization you're in. I'm in a highly collaborative organization, and so that's a natural thing for us to do. But I think about the military, right? So if the military is very much a hierarchical institution, and Randy, you were about as high up as you can get in the fire department, right? And I don't know if it's hierarchical or not, but even leaders that are in hierarchical organizations, I think, have an opportunity to show their teams that they care about what they're asking their teams to do. And I think that's the important sign of servant leadership. So that's what it means to me. I've read 1,000 other definitions of servant leaderships, and they're all right for those people that are talking about it. So for me, that's how I live out servant leadership.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in any profession, I mean, even in the fire service, I mean, we espouse that we're trying to do that. I mean, when the alarms go off and you're in an emergency situation, of course, you get very much in a command and control situation, and there are some times that even servant leaders on a day-to-day basis have to be in that perspective. But for the most part, you can engage your workforce to be a collaborative team. So how do you really focus on doing that on a day-to-day basis? How do you start to create that organizational DNA that people, feel like they're part of that?
Sure. So I think what you're asking is, how do you develop the team in a servant leader model? And I think there's really one key part that is important for servant leadership, and that is a willingness to truly listen. I think oftentimes when I'm at my worst, I'm not listening well. I'm actually just doing, and I'm asking them to do with me. And I think if you don't take time to listen, you will never lead for long. You'll lead short periods, but you won't lead for long. So I think you've got to understand your team's aspirations, and then you got to support the heck out of them. I think was it Booker T. Washington that said, if you want to lift yourself up, lift up someone else. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So support your team, lift your team up to make them feel like they can do what you're asking them in terms of the heavy lifting to do. And then the other part that I think is really critical for leaders is you have to hire people that have the mindset that you think is really important. So for me, I have two premises that we filter a lot of what we do through here at Casady School. So the first is people, and the second is sustainability. We're not for profit. So those two things are really paramount to really everything that we do. And within people, we have what's called ESP. It's our employees, it's our students, and our parents. So people are important, and so is sustainability. And it's not profitability because we're not for profit, but it's sustainability. So we're not going to engage in things that are going to ultimately ruin us as a group. But it is a collective us. And I think back to my growing up days, Randy. I grew up not here in the U.S. I grew up in Brazil. I was born in Rio de Janeiro, and I moved to the Amazon with my parents, who are both linguists. They're missionaries, and they're linguists. And we lived amongst the Muirapitahan people. It's a group of Indians that were numbered in about the 200 to 250 range, not a large group. They're very nomadic. You moved up and down the river based on where fishing was, the hunting and fishing was. Very much if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? They were very concerned about safety, security, food, and shelter. They weren't into self-actualization that I think us as Americans have the opportunity to do. But what this tiny little group of people in the heart of the Amazon understood was they didn't have a word for I in the same way we have the word for I here in the U.S. So when I think of I and me, and I think right now it's pervasive in our culture, it's very much a selfish, what am I entitled to and what should I be allowed to have? No, the Muirapitahan, what the word they use is a word that isn't even I. So if an Indian had gone out into the jungle and had a successful hunt, they would come back and they would never take credit for the hunt. Instead, they would always say something like, they would say, Chiai Chisu, and that means I together with. And they never took credit for themselves because they understood that they were only as successful as the village was successful. And so it was a together with a mindset. And I think that that's the mindset you want. And so when you're hiring, if you don't hire somebody that has that mindset, or at least for me, that's part of who I am. If I hire somebody that is very much about themselves and how it's going to benefit them, I find that they don't stay long in our organization because our organization is built around this idea of kind of that chi, chisu, I together with, meaning the I is important, but the together with is just as important. And I think that's how you lead a team. And I think that's also how you empower the team. So you want to hire people that have a similar philosophy. You don't want lemmings, but you want people who understand the importance of us as a group.
No, totally agree. And what do you think about? Because I think one of the things that, from my perspective, from servant leadership, the willingness to allow your people to fail. Oftentimes,
well, that's a hard one.
It is.
That's a hard one.
It's a really difficult thing from a leadership perspective. But sometimes, to grow organizationally, that you have to have some failures along the way because that's what teaches you how to do it better next time. So, what's your perspective on that?
Boy, I don't know that I have a good answer, Randy, for this, but what I will tell you is I think that you have to have an element of trust in your organization. And if that element's not there, then you're going to find that your team will never take enough risk to actually fail. And therefore, your organization will never move forward as far as you can move forward. And so I think it comes back to trust. And so it's easy for me to say that I have built trust with our team, with my team, if you will, and they can fail. The real test is when it happens. And I think that's where you as a leader have to be willing to step back, never react, but simply assess and go, okay, is this a risk that we agreed to take on that isn't working and therefore it's a failure? Or is it a failure that we've communicated with before and we've worked on and it's not, and it's something that we don't want? So, there are failures that you want to stop and there are failures that you want to keep doing. And so I think as leaders, we have to be willing to acknowledge what type of failure is in front of us and be willing to embrace that failure and quite frankly, celebrate that failure. I can think of an example where at our school, we absolutely were trying to create a new schedule, which, for most of your listeners probably is like, that can't be that hard. But we went ahead and made longer blocks of time for teachers. And we were convinced this was the best way to go. And our teachers simply could not adjust to that change. And it was a failure. It may be the right answer, and it may still be the right answer. But what we didn't do was we didn't equip the teachers with the right skills to be able to be successful at that. And so that risk failed. But in looking at that failure, we recognized that failure might have been more a result of our lack of planning than on the itself being a failure. So I think failure is a good thing to embrace. It's not always an easy thing to embrace.
No, it's difficult sometimes, but there's always lessons learned that will make you and your organization better. So,
without a doubt, agree.
You have a ringside seat to our next generation of leaders, and which I'm excited about. So, what are their views about the polarization that's occurring today in our society, and how do you think that they can maybe help change that as we move forward into the future?
So, Randy, what I want to do is I want to answer that question without making it feel like I'm entering into the fray, right? And so I think you're right. I think that the kids today have the potential to help us get back to that middle ground that says, you know what, we can disagree, but we can still be friends. The Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan kind of mindset that existed back in the day. I do think that the kids I think that they're struggling right now. And I think at this point in their life, it's okay. But I do think that they see the world like the media portrays the world. And so whatever form of media they're most interested in, they tend to be the most vocal about. And so I think that I actually think that there's a bit of a risk right now that our youth today, because their frontal lobal system isn't fully developed and they're ingesting mountains of information that you and I can ingest and develop, and kind of assimilate and put together and form some kind of a thought process around. I think there's an awful lot of parroting that's happening, and parroting. So just a regurgitation of what they hear. And so I think more than ever, I think education has got to teach children how to listen because they're not listening. Social media has created screening platforms that allow them to put stuff out there without having to listen to somebody else's thing. And the truth of the matter is, I'm sure you have a Facebook account. I do. I have an Instagram account. And the reality of it is, if I put something out there that's to one extreme or another, all I end up being is a shouting gong, right? Nobody's really listening. It's merely they're parroting what you're saying, and they're trying to put an exclamation point on it, or they're eviscerating you because you've gone out on a limb and said something that they don't agree with. So I think there's no listening that happens today via social media, which is the predominant thing that kids are involved in today. So I think there's a real risk if we as educators don't help our kids understand the art of listening, because listening is so important to really thinking about how do you live in community and create harmony. We're all part of something bigger than ourselves. And we say this at our school all the time. We say, listen, you're part of Casady School, which means you're a part of nearly 1,000 kids. And each of you have different backgrounds and different perspectives to life. And somehow we find a way to coexist in a healthy way. We're part of the city of the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. We exist in a diverse and a multicultural society, and we have to figure out, how do we exist in this society? We live in a state that is largely, politically a very red state, and not everybody in education is as red as the state might be. But how do we coexist in a way that says we're part of something bigger than ourselves? And then look nationally, we're the same way. So I think we have an obligation as teachers to really help kids understand that just because you have access to something that says something doesn't mean that something is worth repeating and parroting back out. And so the act of listening is so important. And I think more than learning to solve a quadratic equation, having kids graduate with an ability to empathize and to listen will do more for the country than their ability to solve a quadratic equation or be able to have gone through differential equations as a high school student.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think critical thinking is also a very important element. And we see it. I see it with my grandkids. They've got a very short attention span, and they'll take a headline and run with it, and
yep.
Could be right, could be wrong. But
that's so true.
You just never know. So one of the things we've had long conversations about is, you have to look at the trend lines across all of these feeds to really figure out what's really going on. And, I think when we were growing up, we had 3 or 4 news channels, and they all said the same thing. The facts, right. The facts were the facts. And today that's just not true because everybody puts their own little spin on it. So.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And we have access, Randy. We have access to information like we've never had before. And so their frontal lobal system, which is where they kind of develop some of their executive functioning skills, they aren't even developed yet, right? So in a male, oftentimes it won't develop until they're 26. And yet they're bombarded with so much information, and they're asked to do what you and I can do now as adults. They're asked to be able to synthesize all of this stuff and figure out what's maybe right or what's wrong. But I think you're absolutely right in that if our youth today aren't critical thinkers and objective thinkers, then we have a problem. And I do believe that inherent in the design of social media is the idea that if let's say I'm a person who believes 100% in the ability to burn a flag, the American flag. I'm a super patriotic person, and yet I believe in the right to burn the flag. I would never do it myself, but I believe that right is one of the things that our country shares. If I share that onto social media, the algorithms that are designed in social media take me to people that think like that. And so I really began to think that news is what I'm getting. And the reality of it's not. What I'm getting is what I've been parroting. And so it's just coming back. It's like a mirror. It just reflects and says, oh, you think that way? Let me show you these 3 or 4 feeds that are that way. And kids don't have the ability to recognize that that's happening to them. And so they don't think, I wonder if there's another side to the story. Is there another argument that I'm not thinking about? And so I think you're right. Critical thinking is going to be so important for our kids today. In addition to listening, I think critical thinking is another skill that's really, really important.
Yep. Well, I agree. So as we kind of wrap up today, what takeaways would you like to leave with the audience today?
I've always been a believer that if you don't see leadership as an affair of the heart, if you see it as an affair of the head, you're going to die, because it's really an affair of the heart, right? Leadership truly has to be something that you love doing, because it's not easy. Every day I make 10 to 50 decisions that somebody second guesses. Sometimes it's 100 decisions, and sometimes they're ridiculously small decisions. But I think you have to really have a love affair with the idea of being able to empower a group of people to make a change within whatever sphere you're in. So I think you have to really see it as a calling, and something that is an affair of your heart, not an affair of the head. If you're doing it for money or for the head aspect of it, I think you're going to fall, and I think you're going to fall fast. So it has to be something that you really believe in. And I didn't when I got into it, but the more I've learned about myself, what I have found is that lifting up other people is one of the most satisfying things that a leader can do. And so really empowering other people to do the good work. When I have teachers that do some incredible work in our classroom and the kids go on to win national awards for certain things, that makes me feel so good. And I know that I didn't exactly impact that child specifically, but through the leadership, we've empowered the teachers to do the good work that they do. Gives me a lot of satisfaction knowing that my role within the organization plays an impact on what's happening. And I think any leader would say that about any organization. If it's Fred Smith, who is a stickler for, the FedEx guy, he's a stickler for being on time to everything. I'm not that person, so I can't even lay this claim to fame. But I don't think FedEx would have ever gotten to have the tagline when it absolutely has to be there. It's FedEx. If Fred Smith hadn't been a stickler for attention to time and a respect of other people's time. That was something about him that was in his DNA. And I think that he benefited and the organization benefited because of that. And I think that as leaders, there are things about us that oftentimes years later, the impact is felt, not necessarily during the event of leadership.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you'll look back 20 years from now and you'll see the people that you've influenced in the educational system that are doing great things. And you're right. I mean, I think the best accolade we can have as a leader is when one of our subordinates, people that we've worked with, go out and they take over their own school, or they take over their own department, or they get promoted, or they just go off and do something totally different. But they look, they reach back out and say, thanks, because you helped me to, create a vision of what I was to become. And that's what that's the most important thing from a leadership perspective, is how we're positively impacting other people. So
100% agree. And I also think, Randy, everyone has to live their best selves, which by that I mean you have to live your virtue. And you have to be authentic. So I can't be anything other than Nathan. And if Nathan is the right thing to lead an organization at this time, great. If I'm not, then I won't. But I think you have to be authentic to yourself. If you don't, I think you're going to struggle all the time as you lead.
Yeah, no, excellent point. And I think that's a great point to leave on, because we see so much throughout society today that there are people in leadership positions that simply look uncomfortable. And it's almost like they're over their head, and they're not really prepared for what they've been called to do, and yet they're there. And so I think the end result is, usually not good.
Exactly. And what do you hear in politics all the time? Do as I say, not as I do. I mean, you see it all the time in our politicians today and probably throughout life. It's not just politicians, but, you've got to, as again, I really have enjoyed this book that you turned me on to, but you've got to walk the walk. And if that's the right thing for the organization, then you're going to lead it successfully. If it's not, then I think, you'll know that and you'll move on to what's next, your next best thing.
Yeah. If you want to be a great leader, walk the walk, pay it forward, and leave it better than you found it. You do those three things, they'll put a marker on the wall with your name on it. So,
and if they don't, that's okay.
That's right? Okay, because you don't really care about it.
Because you will have done what you needed to do. That's right. That's right.
Well, Nathan, thanks for being with me today. Great Absolutely. Insights. We appreciate what you do in preparing our next generation of leaders.
Well, thank you for having me, and I want to commend you for the work that you're doing. I think I'm going to be listening to this podcast because I know you're going to have people on there that are much smarter than me, and I look forward to learning what insight other leaders have in their fields, because I think we can all learn from great leaders. So thank you for having me on the show.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Crucible podcast. If you have a story of adversity you'd like to share, we'd love to hear it. Visit us at theleadershipcruciblepodcast.com and join us next time as we continue to explore how to live lives of success and significance.